مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. يأتي الرؤساء إلى المكتب البيضاوي حاملين معهم إيميلا كبيرة وخططا عظيمة. داخليا لربما يرغبون في حل مشكلات أساسية في مجال التعليم أو رعاية الصحة أو البيئة. دوليا ربما يرغبون في إنهاء الحروب، بناء تحالفات جديدة وخطر أسلحة معينة. وصل طموح بعض الرؤساء حتى إلى الانفذاء الخارجي. لكن يواجه كل الرؤساء لحظة التي يدخل فيها مستشارهم للأمن القومي إلى المكتب البيضاوي حاملا انباء مروعة. وقعت أزمة، انفجرت قنبلة، تم اختطاف طائرة، ذبح ديكتاتور آلاف المدنيين، انتشر فيروس غريب في معسكر لاجئين، نشبت الحرب بين حليفين. حين تقع الأزمات يتوقف كل شيء في البيت الأبيض. لا يمكن أن يتوقف كل شيء لأن الرئيس يحمل مسؤوليات كثيرة. في هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن سنتحدث عن الطريقة الفعلية لتعامل الرؤساء مع الأزمات مع اللجنة المكونة من خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زوراتي. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. Today we're going to talk about crisis. Every president faces it. He faces crises, emergencies, even tragedies. Do they plan for crises? How do they react to crisis? That's the topic we're going to be talking about with our panelists, both of whom served with presidents who regrettably have known more than their fair share of crises. So gentlemen, let's first begin with, every president comes in with an agenda. Do presidents also come in with a plan to how to deal with the unexpected, with the crisis? Dennis?
You know, I don't know that they do. There may be many presidents who come in thinking that they will have an approach to a crisis, but a trauma hits you, and it's whatever it is you thought, it's not exactly how you're going to respond to it. You know, I look at someone like President Clinton when he came in. Here was someone whose agenda was going to be the domestic issues, and he clearly focused on it. He had Black Hawk Down, and you know that was a kind of trauma. He had the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, a leader who he had literally come to revere, and he understood in that setting that he had to be a kind of pillar of strength. I mean, one of the things I recall that really struck me at the time was that when we got to Israel, and I had briefed him on the plane going over about how Peres had been so shaken by this. And
Shimon Peres.
Shimon Peres had been so shaken by this, and that somehow Clinton now had to take the place of Rabin, who was a kind of source of security and stability for Peres. And I recall vividly when they were about to meet and Peres walked over, extended his hand, and Clinton just embraced him in a bear hug, and it was literally like he not just embraced him, but he lifted him up, physically, literally, and figuratively. You know, for someone like Clinton, that was a kind of natural thing to do. He understood in real moments of tragedy. We saw it in Oklahoma City. He understood how to connect with people. He did the same in Israel after Rabin. That's not something you plan. For someone like Clinton, that was very much within him. With someone like George H.W. Bush, I think he thought a lot about it because he'd been vice president. He had lived through the Challenger. I mean, there were things that he had seen.
The Challenger is the air shuttle, the spacecraft that blew up.
Right. And he'd seen how Ronald Reagan had handled it. I think here was someone who had given a lot of thought to that. But even when you give a lot of thought to it, still the moment, strikes you, and you have to then cope with it. If you look at how we responded when Saddam Hussein goes into Kuwait, the first couple of days of the administration, the messages weren't so clear until the president came and he said, "This will not stand." That wasn't something that he'd planned or he'd talked about with anybody around him. I was actually flying with Baker at the time. We were coming back from Europe, And when Baker heard that, he said, well, that means we're going to be in a war.
Okay, George W. Bush, did he have a plan for what he would do in a crisis?
Well, I don't think any president plans for the crises that ultimately hit them. I think the lesson of modern history is that presidents come in with an agenda, and that agenda is rapidly affected and changed by the realities of crises and tragedies and other things that face an administration. And for George W. Bush, you recall that on 9/11, he was visiting a school, and he had campaigned very much on domestic issues, again, education reform, and was not focused, frankly, on foreign policy the way that his presidency then had to after 9/11. And so I think presidents come in assuming there will be crises, not knowing where those crises will come from, and certainly trying to drive a positive agenda, either domestically or in foreign policy, but are frequently faced with unexpected crises. And 9/11 in many ways was sort of the quintessential version of that. It was a strategic shock to the American system and completely refocused what the Bush administration was about. The Bush administration on 9/11 was about crisis management, dealing with the effects of 9/11, and then reshaping an entire foreign policy that was focused on the war on terror, which was about dismantling and disrupting Al-Qaeda, being very offensive with the use of national resources abroad, and doing everything possible to predictively and preventatively protect U.S. national security. That was a fundamental shift, not just in the administration, but how the U.S. government viewed the world. And I think that's a quintessential moment of crisis where you don't plan for it, but you then have to adapt very quickly. And I think most presidents, just a quick point, when they come into office, what they try to do first and foremost to deal with the potential crisis is surround themselves with experienced high-level cabinet officials and advisors like Dennis Ross, who've been there before, who understand how to deal with moments of crisis, because you can't anticipate every incident that will happen, but what you have to do is rely on the judgment of those around you. And so every president who comes into power hopefully is surrounding himself or herself with people with deep knowledge and expertise.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you about this, because when presidents come in, as you said, they have a certain agenda. And they originally surrounded themselves with people to help them implement that agenda. That may or may not be the right people to help them deal with a terrible crisis that emerges. So to what extent do crises bring out and empower people around the president that weren't really the empowered people on the first day after inauguration, but people emerge, take charge, solve problems, manage crises, and then build on that, to deal with the rest of the administration? Is that also a pattern of behavior?
No, I think that's right. I think in moments of crisis, you have positions and people who emerge as being more important than you would have imagined. The other major crisis of the Bush administration, the 2008 financial crisis, at the tail end of the administration, was actually an interesting moment in this regard, where Hank Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, took on a quite prominent role. You would imagine at the tail end of the second term of an administration, the Secretary of the Treasury is an important figure, but not all that central to a crisis or the functioning of the government. But it so happened that at that moment, you had Hank Paulson, who had once been a captain of finance and the head of Goldman Sachs, was now at the center of trying to secure and save the American financial markets and system. And that was a moment, actually, of great significance, because it elevated somebody like a Hank Paulson, who had that deep experience and had to bring it to bear, both reputationally in terms of his expertise, to help save American finance. It also elevated others, like Tim Geithner, who would then become the Secretary of the Treasury for President Obama, who was then the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve. And so it placed him in a very prominent role as well. And so in these crises, you have the emergence of leaders and the emergence of future leaders as well.
Dennis, same experience in your administrations?
I think a little different. I think a lot depends upon the moment of crises and whether the president has created a set of relationships over time that he has already invested in and where he's kind of reposed a kind of trust. And if there are those people with whom he has a kind of built-in trust, the president will inevitably then rely upon those people. You know, I saw in the case of the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, Baker was already the kind of first among equals.
He's the Secretary of State, Jim Baker.
At that time was the first among equals within that administration. You had others who had to take on a more prominent role because you had a war that was potentially coming. Now, for the first 6 months, Baker was the key player because Baker was the one who was putting together this international coalition. But once the war began, then Baker's role was a different kind of role, and you saw Cheney play a more prominent role than he'd played throughout the administration.
He was Secretary of Defense at the time.
And so a lot depends upon who has a responsibility. You have a degree of trust that may exist, but then who has the lead responsibility? You know, if you look at your administration, Don Rumsfeld was in trouble before 9/11. He had been trying to transform the way the military did business. There was enormous resistance within the building to it. The supporters on Capitol Hill of those within the building in the uniformed services who were against what Rumsfeld were doing were creating all sorts of problems for him. There were rumors at the time that he'd be the first person to be out. And he takes on a predominant leading role after that. He didn't have that relationship with the president, but he assumes a kind of role because, again, people can fill a space. That's what happens with Paulson. That's what happens with Rumsfeld. I think in the first Bush administration, there was such a close-knit team that who had ever been put in a particular position and they assumed that responsibility, then the president was prepared to sort of delegate that to them. Although I have to say again, you look at who he relied on mostly, and it was really a very few people, Baker, Cheney, Scowcroft, and then the people just underneath that level who they relied upon. If anything, the roles became even more cemented, and they became, I would say, they would characterize the rest of the administration the way it operated.
Okay, when we come back, we'll ask whether the United States government, as big and complex as it is, can handle more than one crisis at the same time. So, gentlemen, we've been talking about dealing with a crisis, but of course the world goes on, and the world is a big and complicated place. Bad things happen. It could be 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. It could be all sorts of things. How do administrations stretch to deal with more than one crisis at once?
Well, I think it's difficult, and I think to answer your question bluntly, I think it's very hard for the U.S. government to deal with major crises at the same time. And I think the common wisdom is you can probably fight two wars at once. You can probably handle two crises at once. And part of that, Rob, is the fact that you have so much of the decision-making at a high level and during a moment of crisis and tragedy centered at the White House. And so the American government, the American society, the economy is resilient, it's big, it's broad, and can manage lots of things at once. But when you get to a moment of crisis and when decisions have to come to the top, it's really at the White House, centered with a few people, with the National Security Council or with the cabinet, that you have the concentration of focus and attention. And that's why it grows so difficult to manage multiple crises at once, because it has to demand the attention, resources, and time of a very few group of people who then have to not only make decisions but execute on those decisions. And we saw this in the Bush administration. You had the Iraq War going on while you had Hurricane Katrina, and then you had the financial crisis. Meanwhile, you have the war on terror going on around the world. And so it grows difficult over time to manage multiple crises at once. And by the way, there's lots of sub-crises brewing at the same time that you have to manage and make sure that they don't boil over. And so, simply put, the U.S. government can manage crises, but it can't manage too many high-level crises at once.
That is completely consistent with my experience. You know, in the first Bush administration, we went
We're talking about George H.W. Bush in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we then focused on how we were going to produce a unified Germany and NATO. and I was traveling with Secretary Baker, and we were literally meeting a whole array of different leaders all around the world every 2 weeks. This was commanding high-level attention of not only the Secretary of State. The President was making multiple phone calls. There was constant engagement. And we weren't paying attention to what was going on with Saddam Hussein. I mean, the simple fact is that this was being relegated to a different level of the government because the most senior level and those who were most connected with the most senior level were spending all of our time focused on one thing. I had a responsibility, I had a broad responsibility for Soviet policy, but I was always with the Secretary of State on all of his travels. And while I was overseeing other issues as well, I wasn't paying much attention to Iraq. And I recall being with Baker when we read, and this should not have happened this way, but we saw a letter that went from the President to Saddam Hussein. We were traveling, we didn't clear it. I was sitting in his cabin with him, and I read this letter and I go, oh my God, this was way too soft. And I show it to the Secretary, and he said, how did this happen that we didn't see it? And it was just one of those things that it got, somehow there was an assumption that, you know, that people at the State Department, that we'd be okay with it without us having seen it. You know, so you have these kinds of situations, number one, where you're so absorbed and there's only so many hours in a day that, you know, you really don't have the ability to focus on everything at the same time. One other point I'd just like to make, there's a fatigue factor that sets in as well. You know, immediately after we finish unification of Germany and NATO, then you have the whole Iraq crisis and conflict which stretches on. Well, at the same time this is unfolding, you have the beginnings of Yugoslavia. And there were things that might have been done that could have preempted that, but there just wasn't in a sense, the intellectual energy, the capacity. It's not just the capacity, but it's also the intellectual energy.
There is an energy factor here. I think that's right. And to Dennis's point, you know, in the Iraq context, in the George W. Bush administration, one of the key factors was how much Iraq was consuming time, attention, and energy, political, diplomatic. All the capital that the White House has to spend on crises and events, you know, Iraq was sucking up the oxygen in the room. And I think that was perhaps one of the most devastating parts of the Iraq experience. And especially that period of 2005, 2006, I was in the White House witnessing a real sense of crisis. This is not going well, and we need to do something dramatically different. And that consumed the president's time. And the question you have to ask at that moment is, does crisis subsume all of your attention so much so that you're starting to ignore other things, opportunities that you may have for U.S. national security purposes, but also brewing crises just below the surface?
Well, to both your points here, one, the lifespan of a typical senior administration official, 2 years or so, rapid changeover must affect the ability of the experience and knowledge. Two, the technological change. I mean, I assume huge difference between dealing with knowledge and information a generation ago and in the internet age, which may complicate matters, not just make it easier.
Well, you're thrust into a position where you're constantly having to react to things. And you know, so much of policy should be anticipation, it shouldn't be only reaction. But the pace of information, the pace of events, what you're hit with all the time, what you have to respond to, the 24/7 news cycle, all of these things put you in more of a reactive mode than you might have been.
One thing I want to point out, and this is something that happened in the George W. Bush administration, you have to find energy to anticipate. You have to carve out the time and energy to imagine what could happen. And I think that was one of the lessons in the Bush administration. And I think it probably happens in every administration, that you have to begin to anticipate what might happen in certain crises. And so we began a planning process in the second term of the Bush administration to imagine worst case scenarios in a whole variety of ways. And we had small teams, strategic teams working in the White House and in the interagency saying, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? What then are the consequences and what is our reaction? And what's important there, and this is critical, I think, for American foreign policy, is what can you do, therefore, in anticipation to set the space to affect the environment so that these things don't happen, these awful things don't happen, but if they do, we are in a better position to react, to help our allies, and to impact the crisis. And so Dennis is absolutely right. Dealing with crisis has to be sort of focus number one, but there has to be energy and capital put on planning for potential crises.
Here's where I think having the value of having people who've served before, who know that. So, you know, I can tell you also in the Obama administration, at several different points when I was in, we would deliberately try to look at issues that, in a sense, no one was paying attention to, trying to anticipate potential problems. You know, the Arab awakening came, we had launched 5 months before it a broad interagency review, which 3 of us at the White House had insisted on doing because we felt the kind of stability we saw in the region was a false stability, that it wasn't sustainable.
Gentlemen, I apologize. This is a conversation that we're going to come back to because it's such a rich topic. Thank you. We'll come back to this. We'll come back to this in another month. Thank you very much. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول أزمة غيرت شكل السياسة في بلدكم، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.